Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the top 10 findings of 2021 from Edison Research. We're going to get started, and I will now hand it over to our presenters today, both from Edison Research, Director of Research Laura Ivey, and Senior VP Tom Webster.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Laura, and thank you, Laura. How's it going, Tom?
I'm great. This is one of my favorite webinars of the year because I get to count and I'm learning. So
Count
that's
backwards.
good.
Count backwards even. So that could come in handy.
It could come in handy. And it's also a time for us to celebrate all of the smart people that we get to work with and the kind of the breadth of what we do here at Edison, which is not just what you think it is, whatever you think it is.
Exactly. A lot of, I will agree, also one of my favorite webinars of the year. And, a lot of these findings we present in, hour-long, 45-minute long presentations. And now we get to just pick the top findings. We get to show them all at once. And they really tell the story of the year. They tell the story of 2021. And it's a nice way to end the year. And like you said, spotlight on the studies. And fortunately, it's not just you and I doing the talking. We have our Edison Research team members on with us to share the data.
It's a veritable cast of a dozen today for all of the great things that we do. For those of you that aren't familiar with all of what we do at Edison, certainly we do a lot on the audio side, podcasting, streaming audio, and things like that. We also do a lot of custom research and a lot of election work. We're the sole providers of the exit polling data and the vote count data for the major US news networks. So we're going to touch on a little bit of all of that today. And of course, our number one finding is that the global pandemic went away and COVID will trouble us no more. That was our top finding, Laura. I don't know.
I had not gotten that memo, but thank you. I will act appropriately.
I just issued it. So Laura, why don't you kick things off and sort of count us down? And they're not in any order, are they?
They're not in order. And I think that's important because these are put together in a way that does tell the story, and you can see how they kind of riff off of each other and how they go together. We'll encourage everybody who's in attendance, if you want to share something about yourself in the chats, you can chat with one another as we're going along. Please feel free to do that. We will also post links to the appropriate studies on our website at the conclusion of the webinar, so you can look further into where this data comes from. So we'll kick it off with politics, because who doesn't love a holiday conversation that starts with politics? So finding number 10 comes to us from Drew Malakowicz. Drew is our Director of Political Research. And as Tom mentioned, we do conduct the exit poll of record for the US elections. It's the way that we find out about those people who just voted, our US electorate. So here is Drew with finding number 10.
The most hotly contested election from last November was in the Virginia governor's race, where Democrat and former Governor Terry McAuliffe faced off against Republican first-time candidate Glenn Youngkin. Youngkin was able to win this race by about 2 points to become the first Republican elected statewide in Virginia since 2009. Our Edison Research exit poll helps explain how he did it. During the campaign, McAuliffe attempted to make the election a referendum on former President Donald Trump, warning that a vote for Youngkin was essentially a vote for Trump. But exit poll data shows that this message did not really stick, and in the end, voters found Youngkin much more appealing than Trump. This was particularly true with independent voters, where Youngkin had a plus 20 net favorability compared to Trump's net favorability of negative 28. Winning over these independents proved to be a key element of Youngkin's victory this year, as he carried them by 9 points. This stands in stark contrast to Trump's performance among independents during the 2020 general, where he lost them by 18 points according to our exit poll. It's worth noting that Youngkin also had a higher net favorability than Trump among Virginia Republicans this year. This allowed him to improve his vote share with Virginia GOP voters compared to Trump in 2020. Elections are never won and lost for a single reason, but Youngkin's ability to establish his own brand from Donald Trump appears to be a key reason for his victory this year.
One of the things that all of us at Edison, especially on election days, we all have election duties. Certainly Laura and I were in the trenches on election night of this year. One of my jobs is to look at all of the individual precinct votes, precinct voting that's coming in on the exit polling, and just basically see how it looks precinct by precinct. And I think it would amaze people at how much so many of the voting precincts in America all kind of vote together. You get these votes back and they're like 51-49 or 48-52, but precinct by precinct, they often go 80 to 90% one way or the other, partially through gerrymandering, partially through just people moving from place to place. And that all of which makes those conversations with our uncles at the holiday table that much more difficult.
Exactly right. And yeah, and Drew's point here about the importance of independence and how the campaign was able to separate this group out and pull it away and have it vote in a direction, even if they were not Trump supporters, was key to winning this pivotal election. It was fascinating to watch it unfold on election night.
Yeah.
So that was finding number 10.
And before we get to finding number 9, just real quick, if feel free to use the chat. We're watching the chat. Although we are showing you some videos, we're not trying to fool you. Laura and I are live. So if you have questions, pop them in the questions, pop in the chat. There is a question. I am interested in 2020 US election data. Who can I talk to about this? So our clients are the people to obtain that from, which are the major news networks. The data itself, after a period of time, is archived at the Roper Center. And at the Roper Center is where anybody can access it. So that access in the short term, at least, does not come from us. But I hope that answers your question. But Laura, let's press on.
Okay, let's keep moving. So Nicole Beniamini, who is a VP at Edison, brings us finding number 9. It's from our ongoing study on social media, the social habit. So here's Nicole with finding number 9.
In September of 2021, the Wall Street Journal made headlines after publishing a series of news reports called the Facebook Files, which included leaked internal documents that exposed information such as Facebook's manipulation of its content and its knowledge of the impact that it had on teenage mental health. The anonymous source of the reports, often referred to as the whistleblower, was revealed to be former Facebook employee Frances Haugen during an October 3rd interview on 60 Minutes. Then just a few days later, on October 5th, Frances Haugen appeared before Congress to testify against Facebook. As we at Edison watched the story unfold, we immediately knew we had to include a few questions about it in our weekly tracking study of U.S. social media users age 18 and older called The Social Habit. We found that among the 1,100 social media users we surveyed in November 2021, a little more than half of them, 54%, were aware of the allegations made against Facebook. But hearing is not the same as believing. So we asked those aware of the allegations if they actually believed them. And according to our data, 72% of them did. So essentially the majority. And since social media, along with everything else, has become so politically charged, we assume that belief in the allegations would be higher on one side of the aisle than the other. We were surprised to learn, however, that the majority of both liberals and conservatives who were aware of Haugen's allegations believed them, 77% and 70% respectively. And while there is a wider gap between the two groups, the same majority believes finding holds true even among self-reported Democrats and Republicans. Is this an indication that the concern over social media supersedes political beliefs? Edison will have more about that in the new year, so stay tuned.
I love this data. I spent a lot of time with this data. I know you did too. And one of the things about it, with Democrats and Republicans disagreeing on so many things, this is not one of them. Even the extent to which they would like social media to be regulated, there's agreement about. So I find this data incredibly fascinating, and I can't wait to put more out about it.
Exactly. I love thinking about could this be a uniting, and there's just such irony in the fact that it is such a politically charged environment that that's the place we go to find something that both parties can agree on. So we'll be looking forward to see how this keeps going and trends throughout the next year. Okay, let's move on to finding 8. Finding 8 comes to us from Vice President Megan Lazovic. You've probably seen Megan in webinars for various studies throughout the year. This finding is from 2 studies she presented in 2021. And here's Megan with finding number 8.
This past year, I co-presented 2 webinars in partnership with NPR. The first profiling radio listeners, and the second examining listeners of spoken word audio. What I'd like to share today is something that they had in common. In both studies, data showed that the more engaged a listener, the more receptive they are to ads and sponsorship messaging. In the report Radio, Live on Air, and Everywhere, we used segmentation analysis to identify different types of radio listeners. And this slide shows them in order by those who listen to radio the most, down to those who listen the least. The red bars on this slide represent the percentages of those in each group who typically notice sponsorships or advertisements while listening to AM/FM radio. The group with the most listening, the radio heads, are the most likely to notice ads at 72%. And the group with the least listening, the habitualists, notice ads only 58% of the time. We saw a similar pattern with engaged audiences in the spoken word audio report. We asked monthly spoken word listeners, how often do you notice ads or sponsorships on spoken word audio? 22% answered frequently, 57% answered sometimes, and 21% said never. But look at age 18 to 34. 31% said frequently, 59% said sometimes, and 10% said never. Multicultural audiences notice ads more often than the average monthly listener as well, at 28% frequently and 58% sometimes. This study also showed that young and multicultural audiences were very engaged. They were more actively involved in content discovery, using more sources to find content than other groups of listeners. And they cited more motivations for listening than other audiences, such as connection, education, new perspectives, and self-improvement. So my takeaway is this: invest in your talent and the creative team working so hard to engage with listeners. You'll see your return through satisfied sponsors.
I think, would this be a good time for an ad, Laura?
I mean, I'm engaged. I would listen to it. So yes, definitely.
Yeah. So next month, we're going to be coming out with our super listener study. And that's going to be a look at how the most active podcast listeners react to podcast advertising. It's going to be our 3rd annual. And there's a similar finding in the past couple of years of the super listener study about how engaged people are with ads in podcasts as well. And, I think one of the things that people who've been in the business know, and this is true in radio and in podcasting, is that a host read live ad is incredibly engaging. They're generally sort of the top rated thing, but all ads have some level of effectiveness. And I think that's what we're seeing here. It's not that there's this complete drop off with other kinds of ads. Yes, there are more effective than others. But when you get people engaged in spoken word audio, or in this case, Laura, Zoom audio, then people might just buy what you're selling.
They might, and they often do. And we're going to hear in the finding later on that some podcast listeners we surveyed talked about that and talked about how they engage with brands. And I think that if I had to pick a word for this year, that was not part of the assignment, but if I had to pick a word for this year, I would definitely choose the word connection. I feel like a lot of the themes that we talk about have to do with the connection between hosts and audience and content and listeners and people seeking a connection, and how that connection plays out in a lot of different ways. So let's keep going with our findings.
Keep going.
The next finding is a radio finding, and it's specifically a finding about traditional radio receivers, which you may not have expected to see on a list for 2021. But here's one of our newest Edison team members, Greg Jung, with finding number 7.
With the simplicity of the in-car radio dial rapidly giving way to advanced infotainment systems, it's reasonable to wonder about broadcast radio's place in the cars of 2022 and beyond. Just last month, we debuted new research at the World DAB Summit showing that car buyers still overwhelmingly want to have radio tuners at their fingertips. In the United States, 89% of recent and prospective auto buyers said a broadcast radio tuner should be standard equipment in every car. And 81% of prospective car buyers said they are less likely to buy or lease a car that doesn't have a radio. In addition to the US, this survey was fielded in Australia, France, Germany, Italy, and the UK. When you look at all 6 countries combined, 90% of recent and prospective auto buyers said a broadcast radio tuner should be standard equipment in every car. And 82% of prospective car buyers that they are less likely to buy or lease a car that doesn't have a radio. Around 25% of all the audio that is consumed daily in the US by those aged 13 and up is in a car, according to our share of ear research. What is surprising is that despite the availability of infotainment systems and auxiliary cords and the ability to stream music and listen to podcasts in cars, traditional radios remained in high demand from almost all prospective car buyers.
You know, I worked on this project, Laura, and
Mhm.
we did this in 6 countries, as Greg mentioned. And the crazy thing about this was how high and in lockstep the agreement was across all 6 countries. And you know, a lot of these numbers came back in the high 80s, low 90s, and this was true in Britain, and this was true in France. And I don't think I've seen such strong agreement between the French and the British since I think the Suez Canal incident. So it was wonderful to be a part of that.
Well, and it's rare to see any numbers come back in agreement with those, you know, in the 80s, in the approaching 90% on really any measure. So it's pretty astonishing. And, you know, when we think about how much time we're spending in our cars and the ease of which we use traditional AM/FM radio and how we depend on it for local information and being a local resource, this is really important to know. And I know there's been talk of car manufacturers maybe dropping a radio. That's not what consumers want. We want our broadcast traditional radios. And another thing that people don't realize is that AM/FM radio as a broadcast product is regulated by the government, and it has a community responsibility, unlike some other audio services. So it does provide a different service from just from streaming services.
And
So,
unlike us, we have no community responsibility whatsoever. We can be recklessly irresponsible to the community. But we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. Hey, can I introduce one of these?
Please do, yes.
Okay. I think I'm going to introduce finding number 6 because it's from one of my favorite people, Laura Ivey.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Love the introduction. So yes, I have finding number 6. It's from data that I work very closely with. Some of my favorite data. It's from our share of ear study. And share of ear is the data set that was created by Edison Research in 2014. Many of you are familiar with it. We update it quarterly and we track the share of Americans' daily audio listening. So when people listen, what percentage of time is spent with what thing? So as of our most recent update, almost half of Americans aged 13 plus, and we can take a look at the data, 48% subscribe to a paid audio service. This is over double what the number was in 2015, which was 23%. So a massive increase in the number who are paying for a subscription to a paid audio, to an audio service. Now we know that the individual streaming services and satellite radio, they can tell you how many subscriptions they have, but this data is a measure of people, of subscriptions. So even with all the free radio and audio that Americans listen to, we're willing to pay for audio. And around half of us do that. Money that we might have formerly spent on CDs or albums can go to subscription services. And, you know, as consumers, we're now conditioned, right? We have these monthly subscriptions to things, all kinds of services that charge us small amounts of money. And remember that audio services can be something besides a music streaming service, could be audiobook service, could be premium podcast subscription. We have to take a second also to acknowledge that SiriusXM is a driver of this number. We know that cars are being manufactured, just like we talked about demand for radios in cars are being manufactured and sold every day with devices that are installed for pre-ready for subscription services. And there's just one more point on that, on devices. Over half of all the listening done by Americans age 13 plus is now done on a digital device, such as a smartphone, computer, internet connected TV, or a smart speaker. And then less than half of all listening is done on traditional linear devices like radios, Sirius XM receivers, CD players, turntables, and even TV music channels. And we saw that switch in 2020 where digital surpassed linear. That was during the height of quarantine. And there's no sign of things going back.
Yeah, things don't typically go back exactly the way that they were after a discontinuous event like COVID. I think the analogy I like to use is that our media consumption habits are like a snow globe, and quarantine shook up the snow globe, but the flakes are all going to land, I think, in very different places. And I think I love your observation about digital devices and how quarantine may have accelerated that, perhaps. That's one of those stats that I don't think goes back in the bottle, as it were.
No, it was headed that direction anyway. It just sped it up a little bit. So while we're talking about digital audio consumption, we've got to go to our Moms in Media study. So every year, Edison Research does a Moms in Media study led by the research moms. This group of people who are moms, also researchers here at Edison. So Melissa DeCesar, vice president, also a research mom, brings us finding number 5.
If you are a parent, you know how hectic life gets. And moms in particular are always juggling tasks and looking to their technology tools for ways to help. In our 2021 Moms in Media study, we saw the typical devices like smartphones and tablets get heavy usage. But what stood out as a finding was the adoption of voice-assisted technology. 63% of moms use some form of voice-operated personal assistant. That's right, little helpers like Siri, Alexa, and Google Assistant. And we know we've spent a lot of time at home in the last year, right? And this data is evidence of how moms are taking advantage of voice technology to manage their day-to-day tasks and keep that chaos in check. Voice assistance crosses many devices, smartphones, tablets, computers, even remote controls. But smart speakers in particular really showed their strength with moms in 2021. After holding steady for the last 2 years, smart speaker ownership surged with this group. 46% of moms reported owning some kind of smart speaker. And being able to accomplish tasks hands-free is a total game changer. Make a grocery list? Check. Set an alarm? Check. Get a recipe for dinner and get help with homework? Check and check. We follow device ownership and media habits of U.S. moms each year with our Moms in Media report. And we look forward to 2022 to see if smart speakers and other voice-assisted technology will continue to be embraced by busy moms.
We have done a lot of work on smart speakers and smart audio. We also put out the smart audio report with NPR yearly, as we've done for the past several years. And there's a similar kind of correlated finding in the past few of those about parents wanting to purchase smart speakers specifically for screen-free entertainment. I don't know if is reducing screens a thing that you're intentional about in your house, Laura?
That is a very good question. I have a 14-year-old and then a couple of adult children, and we're always conscious of screen time. I think that we're a smart speaker, a multi-smart speaker household. So absolutely, I think that some of the things that smart speakers provide, we are all about, and substituting for screen time is definitely one of those things.
I want to clean up just a couple of questions here before we get to our next finding. There was a question relating back to the multicultural audience noticing ads. There is more detail on that in 2 studies that we put out this year. Is for Jean. Hi, Jean. And the U.S. Latino podcast listener study and the Black podcast listener study. There's a little bit more detail in those. Those are both available on our website, and you can find a bit more. And then also a question from Michaela. Do you have any indication of the number of audio service subscribers to music centrist services who also listen to podcasts or at least explore the podcast offerings? Subscribers, our data on subscribers is generally client facing only. There is some of this data in Share of Ear, and there's some of this data in our podcast consumer tracker research, which I'm sorry to say is for subscribers only. So there's not much I can share about that here, but we do certainly collect that and look at that regularly, Laura. Mm-hmm.
Yes, we do. For our next point, the person needs no introduction. Tom, you've got our next finding. The first of a few points we're going to talk about podcasting. I know everybody was waiting for this to come onto the list, or like, where's the podcasting?
Yeah.
We're going to start the podcasting points right now.
Well, we are going to start the podcasting points, and we're going to start it with a look at some international research. We have been putting out the Infinite Dial in the United States since 1998. I've worked on it since 2004. I was just a boy then. But I've worked on it since 2004, and we have been lucky at Edison over the past several years to bring out infinite dial studies most recently in the United Kingdom, but also in Canada, Australia, South Africa, Germany, and hopefully more. And the point of doing these is to provide a consistent, comparable source of measurement country to country. We use the same gold standard methodology in all of these countries so that we can not only project the number of podcast listeners and their behaviors and streaming audio listeners and so on country to country, but also compare them, truly apples to apples. And that's what we're going to see in this next graph. The most recent infinite dial study that we put out was in the UK. And here we're looking at the percentage of the population 16 plus in these 4 countries who say they've listened to a podcast in the last month. And if you look, the UK and the US are pretty much tied here at 41%, Canada at 38%, and Australia at 36%. And what's interesting to me about these data is that if we were to look at this slide from 3 or 4 years ago, these bars would not look very even. They would be very uneven, and they've in fact evened out. And you can largely characterize that, I suppose, as some of the other countries catching up to the United States. But the thing that I'm curious about is, are they catching up, and is this sort of a leveling off? When you think about how a track race is run, the people on the inside track are scooted back a little bit, and the people on the outside track are scooted forward. And eventually they all sort of catch up and kind of run the same race. And I don't know if we're all going to run the same race or not. I don't know if this means that growth rates are going to slow. I don't know if this means that we're all going to have kind of differential growth rates as we continue to circle around the track. There are a number of variables, of course, that go into the adoption of podcasting in the country, not the least of which is the availability of content, the availability of cost-effective bandwidth is certainly one of those things. And those things all really seem to catch up, at least in these 4 English-speaking countries. And we've got more to come. Our next Infinite Dial will be another edition of our South African study, which I know we're all very excited about.
Exactly. And that's coming we'll have an announcement that's coming very soon. So that is imminent. Next up, we're going to continue with some podcasting. It's the Senior Vice President, Melissa Kishie. Mel works closely with the Podcast Consumer Tracking Report. You may have seen some rankers published on our site and on our social media. So we're going to go to Mel with finding number 3.
Just a few months ago, the Edison Research podcast team celebrated the 2nd anniversary of the Podcast Consumer Tracker Report. The report provides subscribers with a reliable and regular checkup on the podcast audience, what they're listening to, and the relative reach and awareness of leading podcast networks. Study participants record the names of all the podcasts they've listened to in the past week, allowing us to come up with both a list of top podcasts and a list of top producers. My colleague Laura Ivey presented a top 10 podcast list at the She Podcast Conference in October. Groans ensued, and at least one Edison Twitter follower was feeling a little glum when this slide showed up. Number 3 among weekly women podcast listeners, the Joe Rogan Experience. While it may not have sit right with some folks, a show only makes the top 10 podcast list with the support of men and women. While many might consider our top 10 podcast list mainstream, it's nice to see a little more variety creeping into the top 10. When we looked at this data in 2019, true crime took up 5 of the top 10 spots. Now we see everything from news with titles like The Daily and Pod Save America, society and culture with This American Life and Stuff You Should Know, sex and relationships with Call Her Daddy, and comedy with everyone's favorite Office Ladies. We look forward to sharing our Q4 2021 top podcast lists very soon.
Twitter was on fire with that one. I remember, with Joe Rogan being third with women. But, you know, I call this the Bon Jovi problem. Anytime anyone says something like, I don't understand how 50 million people could buy Bon Jovi records or something like that, my response is usually, what you're saying is you don't understand 50 million people. And
Okay,
that's
fair enough.
that's the Bon Jovi problem, I think, writ large. I guess now we'll call it the Joe Rogan problem. Before we move on, a question in the Q&A from Holland Cook. Hi, Holland. Holland asks, of all the research you've done in 2021, what is the most important finding for talk radio? Holland, I would direct you to worlddab.org and the survey that we did on behalf of World DAB, Radio Player, Xperi, the SCA in Australia, and the NAB. And it was that multi-country study that we did about radio listening in the car. And it's just full of findings about how people who have access to listening to other things in the car, streaming and other technology, choose to listen to the radio for various reasons, including not just ease of use and that it's free, but also for information to stay informed and also for companionship. So I think there's lots and lots there. I know we're actually planning on putting out an American-facing webinar of that, hopefully next month. We're still in talks about that, but there's plenty of stuff in there for talk radio. But enough about that, Laura. What's on your mind?
Okay, well, you know, it's still podcasting, obviously.
Still podcasting.
Still podcasting, because we've got a lot to talk about regarding podcasting this year. We talked about multicultural audiences in a couple of earlier points. Now we're going to hear from, let me just back up. I think I was about to skip a point. No, this is it. Okay, great. This find is actually from a study that premiered this year. Very proud of the study. This is from the Black Podcast Listener Report. There's so many good findings. You really need to take a look at the entire study. But this finding comes to us from Director of Research, Gabe Soto, with finding number 2.
Hello world. So we made it through 2021 and we're still in a pandemic. Remember when some of us thought this was only going to last just a few weeks? Well, we're nearly 2 years in, and at Edison Research, we're seeing over and over that people are using podcasts for a sense of connection to others during this time. That's what I observed in the Black Podcast Listener Report that premiered this year, and that's my top finding, that in podcasting, Black voices not only matter, but are valuable to brands seeking to reach the Black community because of the strong connection these podcasters are able to forge with this audience. So much so that 59% of Black monthly listeners agree they would listen to more podcasts if there were more podcasts with Black hosts. And that's despite 70% saying they actually listened to one in the last month and 41% in the last week. Having these voices on podcasts, it's what's gonna get you that Black perspective, stories of Black community, Black struggles, Black excellence, stories that lead to powerful attachments between listener and host. Many brands and advertisers are paying attention. Why? Check this out right here. The overwhelming majority of Black monthly listeners say they are somewhat or very likely to engage in any of these behaviors if they heard an ad for a brand on a podcast with a Black host. Consideration, trust, recommendation, and purchase intent. It's as if during the pandemic, the podcasters they've come to love resemble a close friend or family member they can trust. A connection that makes Black podcast hosts and audiences highly valuable. To find out more about Black podcast listeners, you can go to edisonresearch.com.
I love that study, and I love the fact that we're able to put that out. Absolutely one of my favorite studies of the year, and a great collaboration between us and our great sponsors on that. Laura, anything you want to add about Black Podcast Listener Study?
First of all, you're absolutely right. And as I mentioned, people should really just go to the site. We're going to post the links for these, but this study was just really full of the fact that listeners are there. This goes back to the point that Megan Lazovic made about engagement. There is a connection between listeners, and particularly Black listeners who want to hear more representation, and they want to hear more from Black voices and Black perspective. And it's just so important to realize that there's space for that, and looking to see this audience continue to grow. And that kind of leads us into the next point, which is our last podcasting point. So this point comes from Manager of Research, Salma Ali, about the Latino podcast listening audience. And she has, and although it's not our top ranked finding, it is finding number one. So let's go to finding number one.
This finding comes from the Latino Podcast Listener Report. This is the second year we have done this study, and the increase in podcast consumption among U.S. Latinos in 1 year is incredible. As of this year, the majority of U.S. Latinos, 56%, have listened to a podcast. This is a significant finding in itself since last year. That number was less than half. So, U.S. Latinos have crossed the threshold of 50% having ever listened. But even more exciting is the finding that 36% of U.S. Latinos aged 18 plus are now monthly podcast listeners. That's 16 million people, and it's a massive 44% increase over last year. To give you some perspective, the overall growth among all monthly podcast listeners in the U.S. went from 37% being monthly podcast listeners to 40%, which is an 8% increase. When you compare an 8% increase among all U.S. listeners to a 44% increase among U.S. Latinos, you can understand why this finding is so exciting. 29% of U.S. Latino monthly podcast listeners also listen weekly, so they are regular consumers of podcasts. And I have to point out that this dramatic increase comes from households regardless of language dominance. 37% of non-Spanish language dominant listeners listen to podcasts monthly, and 36% of Spanish language dominant listeners listen to podcasts monthly. We feel that part of the reason of this increase could be the availability of content that is appealing to Latino listeners, both in English and in Spanish, but also the fact that mainstream podcast platforms are just promoting Spanish language podcasts. So diversity is very important to promote. Now we watch as hopefully the advertising community continues to respond to these podcast listeners.
Before we press on here, I want to clean up a couple of the questions because they are related to podcasts. Steve asks, with the rankers remaining relatively stable month to month and a reported drop in new podcasts recently, are we approaching peak podcast? I'm not in the forecasting business, Steve, but I don't think we are. In the United States alone, last year, there were 1 million self-published books, and I don't think we've reached peak book. I think there's plenty of room. There's plenty, significant percentage of the population that could enjoy podcasts that have yet to even try one. And there's obviously more time in the day that we could spend listening to podcasts. So I don't think so. But I'm not a forecaster. And then Phil has a suggestion, given the recent lawsuit filed against Spotify for members of the deaf community. Do you plan to do future research on the importance or lack thereof of transcripts for audio? It's absolutely something that we'll add, certainly to our podcast consumer tracker, if nothing else. Are we done, Laura? We're not done, are we? I don't want to be done.
No, of course not. There's more. We do have a bonus point because even though we have a top 10 list, ours goes to 11. So here's our bonus point. And we have our manager of research, Kelly Martin, who is bringing our bonus point today.
This finding doesn't come from one study in particular, but is a trend that surfaced in many of our studies this year. Video continues to increase as a part of audio and overall media consumption in the US. Let's start with TikTok, a social media app that serves up short-form videos as fast as you can scroll. The Infinite Dial 2021 found that 86% of the US population aged 12 and up is aware of the app, and TikTok usage has surged, particularly among young people. 44% of 12 to 34-year-old social media users are using the service, up from 25% last year. That's an increase of 76%. Video is also being used to consume podcasts. We got some specific insight from our Black Podcast Listener Report. 83% of Black monthly podcast listeners say they listen to podcasts with a video component. As to the reasons why, listeners say it's easier to pay attention, it's easier to watch with other people, and the video element allows them to read comments from other listeners. An important part of this video trend is YouTube. YouTube continues to gain ground with consumers, allowing users to listen to audio with video. The Podcast Consumer Tracker confirms that among all weekly podcast listeners in the US, nearly 1 in 5 say YouTube as their primary service for podcasts. That's worth repeating. Among all weekly podcast listeners in the US, nearly 1 in 5 say YouTube as their primary service for podcasts. We are looking forward to 2022 to see how video continues to play a part in media consumption.
Yeah, one of the things about that that last slide, number 1 and number 2 are Spotify and Apple. People often wonder, why would you listen to podcasts on YouTube, or why would you go to YouTube for podcasts? And it's a great content search engine, right? It's where you're very likely to find that sort of information. It's great for discovery. So,
That's right.
why not take advantage of that?
And you're already there. For many people, they're already there. So
Exactly.
yep.
So Laura, what was your favorite finding? What was the finding that really spoke to you and warmed the cockles of your heart as you thought about all of this?
That is a really good question. I am going to say, such a good question. I'm going to say, my favorite finding has to be demand for broadcast radio in car, because it's something unexpected. It's something that feels maybe a little counterintuitive with the surge of I'm a big streamer, I'm a big I'm a big aux cord user, but I would definitely want a broadcast radio available in my car. What about you? Let me guess. Does it have to do with podcasting?
No,
Okay, let's
it
hear
does
it.
not. And this is true. I did not write this down. This is a genuine unscripted moment. It's that I am surrounded by so many smart people at Edison. So all I have to do is stand on the X and celebrate all the fantastic people who I get to work with all year long on these wonderful projects, including you, Laura. And thank you for doing this with me.
Mutual. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for all your insight and for all the work. And thank you to everyone on the team who has contributed so much to all of the findings and all of this work.
Cheers, everyone.